Hey everyone, you asked for it. You wanted a little more than just a Wednesday wisdom. So, what we got now is a little bit more Mondays. And what we are going to be doing is we just started in the book of Daniel. So, we're going to be in Daniel 1 through chapter 2, 13 today. And the title of our message today is going to be Go to the Saints, Not the Unrighteous. A matter of fact, this ties in very nicely with last week's Wednesday wisdom. So, how's this going to work? Well, this is going to try and be an interactive Bible study. So, what I'm going to do, I'm going to read and then I'm going to say, hey, go ahead and pause right now. And then you're going to go ahead and read what is in Daniel. And then we'll go ahead and roll the tape again and we'll continue from there. Hopefully, that makes sense. So, anyway, for the book of Daniel, I think it is very important for us to start with a good understanding of what is going on at that time period. The world is in upheaval and there's different kingdoms vying for power. The Assyrians, well, they are the dwindling superpower. And maybe we could say today they're kind of like us, America. I hope not, but maybe. While the Babylonians, they are the rising superpower. And we could say maybe this is like China. Again, I hope not, but maybe. And then there's also Egypt and Israel, and they're kind of insignificant at this time, maybe like Europe, but they're very significant for what's going on in Daniel. So, with those kingdoms mentioned, I think it's important to know who is who in the zoo. And so that said, I think this next part might be a bit boring, but again, I think it's important to understand the context of the time. So we're going to do it anyhow. So again, the Babylonians, they're the big dogs, and their king is Nebuchadnezzar or Nebuchadnezzar, however you want to pronounce that. His reign was around 605 BC, so this is 600 years before Christ comes. And remember, Israel was one mighty kingdom and then split into two kingdoms. And the northern kingdom was named Israel. And they had already fallen to the Assyrians, the former or the dwindling big dogs. And this was about 100 years before this time period. But by God's grace, the southern kingdom, Judah, was still hanging on by a thread. And this is important to know because this is the context of the kingdom that's going on when Daniel is writing his book. Did I lose you? Okay, good. Anyway, so again, Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, is hanging on by a thread. And the king of Judah, this is, at the time, this is the king Josiah. He was the last good king of Israel or of Judah, if you remember. And so again, superpowers are trying to vie for power, and then you got the little dogs, Israel, Egypt. Well, Josiah goes to the Pharaoh of Egypt. He was Necho to make an alliance against one of the bigger dogs, right? So these little dogs, Judah and Egypt, are teaming up against the big dog, the rising superpower, Babylon. But unfortunately, this alliance went south pretty quickly, and Pharaoh Necho actually had the good king Josiah murdered. He then Necho then installed Josiah's son, and this was Jehoahaz. He was the king. And Jehoahaz wasn't what Necho expected either, and then only after 3 months, Necho had Jehoahaz in prison. And so much for that alliance. Anyway, so then, I know, again, probably losing you, but just stick with me. I think it's good to know for context. So Necho gets rid of Jehoahaz, and then he puts in Josiah's brother, or more accurately, his half-brother as king. And his name was Eliakim. And then Necho ended up changing his name to Jehoiakim. And we're going to find out how this is important in a second. Stick with me. So anyways, to make this simpler, Josiah was the last good king. And after him, God was pretty much done with Judah. So in 3-month period, we have Jehoahaz and now Jehoiakim. So what does this have to do with us? Okay, I know, just follow me. So anyways, Jehoiakim, he is now the king of Judah when Babylon, so the little dog, Babylon, the big dog, has had enough with Judah's alliance with Egypt, the little dogs. And because of this, the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, is about to squash the pesky little dog, Judah, who again was Jehoiakim the king. So right now, I want you to go ahead and pause, and you're going to go ahead and read Daniel 1 and Daniel 1, verse 1 and 2. Go ahead and pause now and read that. Okay, you back? So again, Babylon had had enough of pesky Judah. So King Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Jerusalem. This is the capital of Judah. And of course, Nebuchadnezzar wins. And the result was that the Lord, God, this is God, delivers Jehoiakim into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. Um, God was finally done with Judah. They had blown it time and time again, and God said, "I finally have enough. I'm handing you over into Babylon's hand." His patience with their Judah's disobedience had worn out. So interestingly, there's a little speculation because we're not sure if King Jehoiakim, remember he was the king at the time, was taken into Babylon to serve Nebuchadnezzar there, or if he stayed in his homeland in Jerusalem and served the king there. But it definitely says in the passage that he served Nebuchadnezzar. But it does sound like, in this passage here, it does sound like he was taken into Babylon. Yet, according to 2 Kings 24, 1 through 2, it simply reads that Jehoiakim served Nebuchadnezzar for 3 years. So 3 years is important. But after that 3 years, he rebelled. So Jehoiakim serves the king dutifully. Then he says, "You know what? I ain't going down with this. We're gonna rise up against Babylon." And we see in verse 6 in 2 Kings 24. So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers, and Jehoiakim, so Kim and Kin, his son, became king. So with that understood, it seems like Jehoiakim stayed in Jerusalem and then was killed for treason. He betrayed Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar. So again, we don't know exactly, but perhaps Jehoiakim was taken into Babylon. He got re-educated to learn the Babylonian way to govern, and then was sent back to Jerusalem to govern the Babylonian way. So if this is what happened, then Jehoiakim served dutifully. Then after 3 years, he rebelled and he was murdered for treason. Or maybe he just died of natural causes. Again, we don't know exactly based off the text. So I know I'm rabbit holing a little bit here, but to close out the end of Judah's kingship, right? So we're talking about the last kings of Judah. So Jehoiakim, this is Jehoiakim's son, succeeds Jehoiakim, and he, like his father, rebels as well. And Nebuchadnezzar, he wasn't having it. So he takes Jehoiakim captive into Babylon. And this we know for sure because in 2 Kings 25:29 it reads, Jehoiakim changed his prison clothes and had his meals in the king's presence regularly for all the days of his life. And he was given a regular allowance. Now, this is pretty rad, so pay attention here. It's so cool, actually, that I wrote about it in my book. So you see that archaeologists recently found an ancient Babylonian tablet which describes the certain allotments of royal oil. And guess what was written on that tablet? What was inscribed? I bet you got it. Yes, that's right. Jehoiakim, king of Judah. So apparently part of Jehoiakim's regular allowance was this allotment of oil. So you might be thinking, well, what's so awesome about this? What's so great about it? Well, this tablet emphatically proves the books of Kings, Chronicles, Samuel, and this one, Daniel, are not just stories. They're not fables. They're not wives' tales. They're not fairy tales. No, this is real history. This stuff really happened, y'all. It's awesome. Believe it. All right. I know, I geek out. Anyhow, continuing. Since Jehoiakim was taken captive, Nebuchadnezzar still needed someone to govern Judah. So the final king that he installed was Zedekiah. This was the very last king of Judah. And Zedekiah was king for 11 years when he too rebelled, and this was the last straw. Nebuchadnezzar had enough of pesky Judah, and he was done. And in 586 BC, he finally ended Judah's kingship. He destroyed Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, including the temple and all. Israel was no more, and matter of fact, it wouldn't become a nation again until 70 years ago, 1948. Anyhow, so I know that was kind of a big rabbit hole, but back to our storyline. In verse 2, you see Shinar. Now, Shinar is um, also called Babel, or it's the capital of Babylon. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pause here, and I want you to read verses 3 through 7. Oh, sorry, are you back? I had to get a quick drink. Okay, so we see here in verse 3 through 7 that Nebuchadnezzar had ordered his officials to take some of Israel's leading men into Babylon. So Daniel was one of these dudes. Yeah, and now this is interesting. Now, whether Daniel actually wrote the book of Daniel himself or not, this scholars debate. But the apocalyptic writing style, or the writing style of like Revelation of that time period, it suggests that this writing style, that the book was written in the second century, so 200 BC. And this would have been 400 years after Daniel's time. So if this is true, then the prophecies of Daniel are not really prophecies. I hope you're following me with this. Because the events that Daniel's talking about would have already happened. So therefore, it's actually history and not prophecies. But the author often uses the first person. The author of Daniel uses the first person, me and I, in his writings. So this strongly suggests that Daniel actually wrote it himself. But regardless, anyway, whoever wrote it, in verse 4, we see that they took great care to describe the kinds of young men who were brought into Babylon. And these guys were very, very smart. So maybe think of the situation this way. Remember, Babylon's the big dog taking out the little dog. So maybe it's kind of like if China were to conquer us, instead of killing our brightest minds like, Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg or, whoever, instead of killing these guys, China would then want to use them and reprogram them so they can use them for their purposes. So Daniel is one of these guys, the brightest minds. He's an Elon Musk. And Nebuchadnezzar wants to use him. So he's bringing him into Babylon to use him. And since this is so, Daniel and the other men are schooled in the language of the Chaldeans. So it says your passage might say Chaldeans or Babylonians. They're interchangeable, one and the same. Kind of like saying America or the United States. So Daniel is schooled in the language of the Chaldeans for 3 years. And this language that they spoke was Aramaic. Now, this is really cool because the writer of Daniel starts out in the very beginning writing in Hebrew. And then in verse 5, after mentioning that he was taken captive and being schooled in Aramaic, he switches to the language of the Chaldeans, which is Aramaic. So then at the end of the book, we're not going to be there yet, but at the end of the book, the writer actually switches back to Hebrew. So this strongly suggests that David or Daniel actually wrote this, because you see, Daniel was a Hebrew, so therefore he would have started out writing. Then he's schooled in Aramaic, so he switches to Aramaic, and then we'll find out later, after the Babylonians fall, the Persians come in, so Daniel then switches back to Hebrew. Makes a lot of sense. So I will just say from here on out that Daniel is the writer of Daniel. That is what I believe. So that's what I'm going to say. And so in verse 5, we see that the king he's wining and dining these new captives, just as the king did with King Jehoiakim. And basically he was saying, see how great Babylon is here? Forget all your old life in Israel. It's garbage there. Babylon's awesome. And Nebuchadnezzar probably assumes that he convert the brightest minds, if he can convert the Elon Musk of Israel to the Babylonian way of life, then the remnant left back in Jerusalem will go ahead and fall in line with the wise men of Judah. And so this reprogramming process, turning them into Babylonians, would basically result that there would be no more scuffles or conflicts back in Judah or Jerusalem, solving Nebuchadnezzar's problem. Verse 6, Daniel specifies that he and his three amigos were not just Israelites, but they were from the tribe of Judah. So what's so great about this? Well, the tribe that was most obedient to God was Judah. And who was the most obedient of all that came from Judah? You're right. Yes, Jesus. Jesus came. He is the lion from the tribe of Judah, the one most obedient of all. Um, Moving on to verse 7, it mentions that the four, Daniel's three buddies, received new names. So names, this has to do with their reprogramming process. So you see, by assigning them new names, the king was attempting to convert the four to the Babylonian gods. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to get Daniel and his friends away from the one true God and instead to his little lesser gods. And Nebuchadnezzar did this because he knew that by keeping the four's names, they were constantly being reminded of God. Because each four of them in Hebrew, their names all have God in it. So El, it means God in Hebrew. So Daniel and Mishael. And then Aya, or Yah, meaning Yahweh, is Hananiah and Azariah. So when these four guys were called by their name, they were automatically reminded of God because God was in their names. So Nebuchadnezzar had to get those names out. And so he changed their names to his gods. And his god, the leading little god, was Bel. And he was the most prominent. And since Daniel was the most prominent of his friends, Nebuchadnezzar renamed him Bel Teshazar, which means Bel, little god, and the Teshazar means protect the king. So Bel Teshazar means little god, protect King Nebuchadnezzar. And then the other fellas, they end up being named after Babylon's lesser gods. All right, so it's time to pause again, and I want you to go ahead and read verse 8 through 16. All righty, you back? Here we see that the four were not having it with this reprogramming process. The king could take away everything from the outside, but by no means could he take away what was on them on the inside. So they pre-decided that they would not defile themselves and they would remain devoted to Yahweh, God. So this is awesome, and we should take notice. We should be like these guys. But of course, for us to do so, to be obedient, we have to know the word. We have to know our Bible. And therefore, they knew Leviticus 11:47, which reads, make a distinction between the unclean and the clean, between the edible creature and the creature which is not to be eaten. So apparently here, the creatures that were being served to them were not to be eaten. So they said, thank you very much, but no, we'll drink water and be vegans. They weren't having it. And normally their disobedience would have resulted in the commander's head rolling. So the guy watching over them, they're not being obedient, he's going to lose his head. And probably the four of the guys being disobedient as well. But God, always love that, but God, he granted favor. And the commander allowed the four to try out their strange diet for a period of 10 days. And if the four looked healthy, then all good. But if not, then Lucy, you got some explaining to do. But after the 10 days, because of their obedience, God not only didn't make them look haggard, but he actually made them fatter and they look better than all the other captives. So, lesson for us, when we are obedient to God, he has our backs. Be obedient to him. All right, so question here. Do we see our bodies as temples of the living God? If so, do we defile it? What if we viewed our food as clean versus unclean? Or maybe instead natural versus processed foods? If we ate only natural foods, will we look healthier after 10 days? My guess is yes. Now, I ain't saying we need to be vegans, but what God makes good, we got to agree that man tends to jack up. God's food is good, man's not so much. And Ecclesiastes 7:29 supports this. It says, God created man upright, but they have gone in search of many schemes. Our food has a lot of schemes in it. So let's put what God has designed into our bodies rather than what man has. Okay? All right, we're going to pause here again, and you're going to read verse 17 through 21. Go ahead. You're back? Okay. Not only did God make the four look healthier and fatter than all the rest of the captives, but he also made them smarter and wiser. And Daniel was even able to interpret visions and dreams. And since the four were obedient to God, at the end of their 3-year reprogramming process, they stood out among all the rest. And this landed them in a high place of honor in front of the king. Now, this is kind of funny and a little ironic because by the four not eating the king's food, they were actually being disobedient to him. Yet, as Peter says in Acts 5:29, he boldly proclaimed, "We must obey God rather than man." Amen to that. And God always rewards our obedience to him. Usually not in the way we imagine, but usually in better ways. So let us follow Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's example. Okay, now here in verse 20, we see that the four are 10 times wiser than any pagan magician or conjurer. It's not really a shocker that the one and only God would be wiser than any pagan demon. Verse 21, we see that Daniel serves not only Nebuchadnezzar, but all the successive Babylonian kings that come after him until the time where the Persians take over. And this is King Cyrus. And Daniel will switch back. Later on, King Cyrus comes over, and that's when Daniel switches back to Hebrew that I talked about earlier. All right, so we're going to go ahead and pause here, and you're going to read, start in chapter 2, reading verses 1 through 4. All right, did you catch anything suspicious here? Again, Daniel and the other captives, they were in a 3-year training program. And at the end of that period, the four, they entered in the king's personal service. But here in chapter 2, verse 1, it says that their service happened in the 2nd year of the king's reign. Pretty strange. How can we reconcile this? Is the Bible wrong? Of course not. Well, so here we go. The 1st year of a Babylonian king's reign was actually called the accession year. And then the next year was year 1, and the year after that was year 2. So while the date of the 4 wise guys, Daniel and his 3 amigos, wasn't actually, since the date of them was actually the 3rd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the Babylonians only calculated it as the reign of year 2. Make sense? We would say year 3, the Babylonians would say year 2. It's the same thing. Why is this important? Because the Bible is never wrong. It has no contradictions, not contraindications. It has no contradictions. The Bible is never wrong. It is inerrant and infallible. That means it can't be false, and it is never wrong. Or it is always right. Okay, verse 2. The king is having nightmares, and he cannot sleep. He calls in the clinicians and the therapists of his day to help him out. And this makes sense for him. But for us, and I said this in last week's Wednesday Wisdom, in 1 Corinthians 6:1, it says, "Does any of you, when he has a case against his neighbor, dare to go to law or court before the unrighteous and not before the saints?" Shouldn't do that. So question, when we have mental, emotional, even physical issues, do we go to the unrighteous to have our problem solved? Do we go to doctors who just want to peddle drugs on us? Do we go to therapists who don't provide the healing power of Christ? Should we not go to the saints? Obviously, this is a rhetorical question. Yes, we need to go to the saints, and that is why we started FirstinFaith. But of course, the king was not at this time a follower of God. So this makes sense that he would go to the unrighteous rather than to the saints. And so in verse 4, he says, the unrighteous that he goes to, they say, "We can help you out. We can interpret your dream, no problem." But they probably, as we'll see in a second, they probably wish that they didn't say that. So go ahead and pause, read verse 5 through 9. Okay, so now Nebuchadnezzar gives the wise men of Babylon the conditions for helping him. To solve the problem, you're going to be greatly rewarded. It's going to be awesome. However, just a little thing, if you don't, you're going to get your arms and your legs lopped off. And for a special bonus, we're going to burn down your house too. Awesome. Good times. Verse 7, we see that the sorcerers start to backpedal a little bit and start saying, did we really say we can help you out? I think maybe we meant, I think we can help you. And in verse 8, Nebuchadnezzar, he catches on to these wise guys, and he says, "You agreed to speak lying and corrupt words." Caught red-handed. So again, we shouldn't go to the unrighteous to have our problems solved. Okay, we're going to wrap up here. Your last reading here. Read verses 10 through 13. Okay, in verse 10, after getting caught, the wise guys fess up and say, "There's not a man on earth who can help do this thing." And then, this is kind of cool, they say something totally rad that I don't think they even realize they said. No, I know they don't realize it. They say, "Except gods, little gods, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." So although these guys are unrighteous, they were 100% wise here, because the word dwelling is also translated as tabernacling. And the tabernacle is the very place where God dwelled here on earth. So yes, not in mortal flesh, but in spirit. But a little further, not only did this God come in spirit, but as 1 John tells us, he also came in mortal flesh. The word became flesh. Verse 12, here the king loses his mind and says, "I'm not only going to rip off your heads, I'm going to do so for all the wise men of Babylon." Unfortunately, this meant for Daniel and his homies too. So anyhow, this is going to be a cliffhanger until next time we get together, probably in 2 weeks. But the big takeaway today is, it is possible that when we seek the unrighteous, the righteous can be affected too. What am I saying here? Well, if we go to the unrighteous to have our problem solved, and we take their advice and heed it, well, not only could we be affected, but our families as well. So don't do it. We must know the word, like the four, and be obedient to it. And when we do, God will have our backs, and usually in better ways than we can imagine. So I hope you liked this first Bible study. We got many more in the future. And as always, stay biblically resilient.